Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well. Today we're looking at the 1930s, which is also known as the Great Depression. So in the last decade we just studied on Tuesday, we looked at the 1920s and how that was very much a period known for its exuberance, celebration, lavish spending, parties, and now we're moving into another decade which is very different from that one. So this is a fill in the blank note. As you go, you should have another tab open with your copy of the note in it so you can fill in the blanks as I go through this video here. There's also going to be times where you can pause and interact with the slides on your end to do some typing, and you'll see the activities as we go. So let's head into the 1930s or the Great Depression. So the very first thing you are going to do is you are going to pause this video and do a little game. So with the prosperity that boomed in the 1920s, more people began buying stocks and investing in Canadian companies. So what are stocks? If you watch the video, so if you pause my video and go and watch this one, it will go over what exactly stocks are and explain the idea of the stock market. In a very short summation of it, stocks are shares, so pieces of a company that you can buy. And if the company's value goes up, then the value of your piece of the company also increases, so you can sell it and you can make money. So with the 1920s, there was a lot of prosperity. There was a huge economic boom midway through the decade into the end of the decade. And people had extra money that they could spend. So they started investing in Canadian companies and buying on the stock market. And if you watch this video, I'll explain the stocks. And then what you're going to do is pretend you are in the 1920s and you've made some money. So instead of going out on town and spending some money at a speakeasy or with friends, you're going to actually try to make more money by investing in the stock market. So you're going to play the stock market simulation game. If you click the link embedded here, it will bring you there, and you're going to essentially learn how the stock market worked in the 1920s. So feel free, pause the video now and then come back to this once you've watched the video and play the stock market game. Okay, so hopefully at this point you have gone through and actually done the stock market game, watched the video, so you have a little bit of a better idea of how the stock market works. So really, what does this mean for the decade? Because if you played the stock market game, you should have. If you haven't, again, pause now, go back, do the stock market game. If you played the stock market game, at the end, you notice that everything went bankrupt. There was a big crash in the stock market. So here it says the stock market crashed. What does this mean for the rest of the decade? Well, we see the Great Depression. So with the stock market crash, we see the economy just fall into a big slump, and that affects many people throughout the world. And here in this picture, you can actually see the New York Stock Exchange with everyone kind of gathered around to see. And this was on the day known as Black Tuesday, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Okay, so we're doing a little bit of a look at inquiry again. So in the 1920s, we based our learning on an inquiry question, which was should we really call it the Roaring Twenties? We are going to look at inquiry again, but this time you're going to be formulating the question. So we'll go over a brief summary of the 1930s in Canada, and then you're going to brainstorm some inquiry questions. As we move through the topics and evidence, you'll have the opportunity to add and edit your questions, and in the end, you will pick one to explore a little more. So instead of me giving you an inquiry question, this time you are going to come up with your own inquiry question. And you're going to start with a summary. So we'll go over a summary of the Great Depression. So that can help you kind of formulate some initial questions. Then we'll learn a bit more in detail about the 1930s, and you'll be able to go back and edit your questions or add to your list of inquiry questions. And the goal is at the end, you will have at least one inquiry question that you like, and you're going to explore further. So first, let's look at our brief summary of the 1930s. So here we can see in this brief infographic, we have here in the center, it says the stock market crashed in 1929 and Canada and most of the world fell into a financial Great Depression. So this meant stock prices crashed, companies became worthless, the value of resources decreased drastically, and really the price of living was difficult for many to keep up with because they weren't able to make money, because people struggled to find work and make enough money to survive. So with the stock market crash, it leads to big unemployment because companies have to start laying off people. And we see then people not having income, so they can't spend money to rebuild the economy. We also have the prairies, which are devastated by a drought, which is called the Dust Bowl, and we'll get into that a little later. And through all of this, the government does attempt to find Canadians economic relief, so they do try to help Canadians in different ways, but the economic hard times is just ravished many countries for the entire decade. So this is kind of a very brief summary of the 1930s as a whole and the different parts we're going to look at. We're going to look at the stock market crash. We're going to look at how people lived. We're looking at the prairies and what happened there with the climate and the relief that happened. So now we're going to formulate some questions. So remember, what makes a good inquiry question? Well, one, it's arguable, so it resists a very simple answer. Two, it's complex, so not just a simple yes or no answer. There are many sides to it, and you have to really support your answers for it. Three, it's specific in language, so you resist vague words or undefined words. And four, it's clear and concise and resists very broad topics. So keep these parts in mind, these criteria in mind for when you're formulating your own inquiry questions. So here, you can pause the video and write in your slideshow. You can brainstorm some inquiry questions about Canada in the 1930s. So brainstorm a few. They don't need to be well developed. Really, what comes to your mind? What questions come to your mind about the Great Depression in the 1930s? Once you have a few questions you like, continue on in the slideshow, and we're going to continue learning more about the 1930s, and you'll be able to come back and rethink your questions. So this is just kind of our starting point. No need to spend too much time trying to think of these big complex questions. Just think about what your initial thoughts are for the 1930s and questions you have about this decade right now. So take a moment, pause the slideshow, and then we will continue on. Okay, so let's look into what actually happened in the 1930s with the stock market crash. So on October 29th, 1929, the New York stock market crashes, and this date is known as Black Tuesday. We have about 16 million shares that were sold that day, and the value of the shares decreased by 30 billion. So that is a drastic plummet. So your stocks started somewhere up here. The price of them were very high, and then by the end of the day, they had lost about $30 billion on the stock market. With this, world trade sharply declined as well. So what tends to happen is if there is a big dip in the stock market, so things start to slide, trade starts to slow. Everyone kind of backs up, and people don't want to invest, and world trade really just kind of stops, and everyone sees what happens for a moment. Everyone kind of takes a pause. So that's what happened, is that on that day, world trade stopped, everything kind of stopped, and we're going to look at really what happened after this day and the long-term effects of this. So this stock market crash, Black Tuesday, really set the stage for a long time, a long period of economic hardship. So it was so drastic that it was very difficult to get back out of this. Sometimes we have days where the stock market drops a few points, or shares go down. It happens. They bounce back up or they stay down. But having a dramatic crash like this created a big impact. And it was the news all around the world. You can see the picture here with the Brooklyn Daily Eagle going over the Wall Street stock market crash. And yes, the stock market is in New York, but we are so tied to New York, and most of the world's economy is very tied to New York at this point, that it has that big of an impact on us as Canadians. And then here you just see the business cycle. You'll see it a little better on your screen when my video is not blocking it. But it's very much a cycle. You'll start with prosperity, and then you'll see inflation. So prices start rising, and then we eventually get down to a recession as things don't really match up, a depression, and then we start building again. So when inflation happens, the cost of living rises, but wages don't always rise. So that's when we kind of get into recession, as people start or stop essentially buying and investing, and they can't afford the price of living. So then we get into that recession and depression. So what are the causes of this Great Depression? Well, I'll be honest, the causes are very debated by historians, by economists. There are many points to consider. We're going to look at a few of the more broad topics today. So the first thing that is kind of pinpointed as one of the main causes is buying on credit, so buying with loans. So what is a loan? Well, a bank or a lender gives you money on the understanding that you will repay them that exact amount borrowed. Sometimes repayment has interest, so extra fees on top of that money. So the way we tend to experience loans today, or you might experience loans, is going to be through student loans. So a bank or through programs like OSAP, they will lend you money to pay for your schooling. And then at a certain time, you have to start paying them back. So if they lend you $5,000 in maybe 5 years, you have to start paying them back that $5,000. So it's really nice when you get that money up front and you can pay for something right away, but you also have to keep in mind that you do have to repay them. And sometimes they charge interest, meaning that you have, instead of paying just that $5,000 back, you might now have to pay an extra $500 back on top of that because they've charged you interest. So hopefully you'll learn about that a little more in your math class as well, with mortgages and interest rates and things like that. But this was a big thing in the 1920s. People started buying on credit and getting loans. Companies could easily take out loans and borrow money from banks to help switch production from wartime to peacetime. So remember, in the 1920s, we're still seeing that switch over from a wartime economy. So factories and businesses are still making that switch from producing munitions to back to what they were originally producing, regular clothing, everyday items instead of war items. So banks and companies were giving them loans pretty easily so that they could make that switch and they would have an easier transition. But this meant that those companies had big loans to pay off. Investors also borrowed money to buy more shares in these companies on the stock market. So if you want to go out and you want to buy a share in an oil company, and you don't have enough money to buy a share in that oil company, you can borrow money from the bank to do it. So say your share cost $100 and you only have $50 in your bank account, you can go get the $100 from the bank, and the bank will take your money, or the bank will give you money, and you can go buy that share. And then hopefully your share becomes very expensive. Your share grows in price. So you might have bought in at $100, but then in a year, your share is now worth $200. So then at that point in time, you can go sell your share and you can get $200 back. So that way you can pay off your loan for $100 and you've made $100. So that's how it worked. People would buy or borrow money so that they could buy shares. So many consumers borrowed heavily to pay for high-priced items like cars. So we talked about in the 20s how about 50% of Canadian homes had cars, and that was because people were going out to borrow money so they could afford it. Any decreases in sales and prices meant that investors couldn't sell off their shares at a high price and therefore couldn't pay off their loans. So if we do that example again, if we invested in an oil company, so we got a $100 loan from the bank and we bought that $100 share, And a year later, that share price has actually dropped. So it didn't make you any money. It's actually gone down to about $50. You have to either decide that you're going to stay and hope that it rises, or you're just going to go out and take your $50. So you could give your share back to the company, sell it back to them, take your $50, and now you have to go to the bank and you need to pay back that $100. Well, you only have $50 in your pocket now. So you have to give them that 50 plus try to find the rest of it somewhere else. So if your share price didn't go up, if whatever you purchased, the value didn't increase, you couldn't necessarily pay back your loans. So when the stock market crashed, lenders demanded loans be repaid right away. So banks and other companies and other lenders demanded that if you had borrowed money from them, you pay them back because they were worried they weren't going to be paid. So people and institutions went broke and people stopped investing. So all of a sudden, you can't repay your loans, or you can just repay your loans and you don't have money to invest in the stock market or invest in companies anymore. And you might see it as a little too dangerous as well. Another big cause of the Great Depression, I should say too, you should hopefully know this by now, in your fill in the blank notes, the underlined pieces of information in my video are what you type into the blank spaces in your video. Sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier, but just as a reminder. So the lack of financial regulations was also a big cause of the Great Depression. It was way too easy to actually borrow money to invest in the stocks. There weren't as many checks and balances that are in place today to get a loan. When the stock market crashed, people could not repay their loans as their shares and investments were worthless. So American banks had even purchased stocks with depositors' money, so regular people's money. So say you were banking at the Bank of America and you had $1,000 in your bank account at the Bank of America. Well, the Bank of America took your money, took that $1,000 that they're holding for you, and invested it in stocks to hope that they could gain money for themselves. And when the stock market crashed, they lost money. So it was very dangerous for banks because that meant they weren't making any money. And it led to depositors being worried. So when the stock market crashed, depositors worried that the banks had lost too much money and quickly withdrew their money from the banks. So they emptied the banks of their cash and bankrupted many. So people panicked. They panicked. They knew that these banks had invested money in different companies on the stock exchange. When the stock market crashed, they knew the banks had lost money. So people rushed the banks to get their money out. Now, Canada had better regulations for the banks, so less people lost their full life savings due to the bank's failure at this time. But this whole idea of the banks losing people's money really set up a generation of people that were not confident in giving money to banks, in loaning to banks. People kept money hidden in their house places because they did not feel comfortable giving it to a bank in case the bank lost their money. There was also the vulnerable Canadian economy. So our economy was very much tied to the United States economy. Like I mentioned a little earlier, US companies had began cutting back or closing their Canadian branches. So in the 1920s, we see many companies like car companies, food companies coming in to Canada and setting up factories, setting up assembly lines, setting up stores. And then when the stock market crashes, or even leading up to the stock market crash, the US had started pulling back from Canada a little more. So this impacted many people who had jobs at those factories and jobs in those shops. Us here in Canada, we depended on exports to the US and all over the world. So about 33% of Canada's gross income at the time was from exports. So when I say exports, I mean us selling resources to other countries. So say we have wheat. Wheat was one of our biggest exports in the 1920s and before then and through the 30s as well. So Canada, we had a lot of wheat and we had good wheat and many people wanted it. So we would sell our wheat to the United States or to Great Britain, to Germany, to whoever would buy it, and they would buy it and we would sell it to them. So that would be an export. So selling our resources to another country. And because our economy and our income was very reliant on exports, when world trade stops and people aren't buying resources from other countries as much, that greatly hurts our economy. So countries put tariffs and duties on imports. So tariffs and duties are additional fees or taxes put on top of products from another country to encourage people to buy locally. So for example, Canada could sell wheat to the US for $1 a bushel, while US wheat would cost $1.50. To encourage Americans to buy American wheat, they would put a tariff on Canadian wheat, which would bring the price to $2. So now the Canadian wheat was more expensive than the American, so the American people would buy American wheat. We do the same thing. We put tariffs on certain resources as well that come into our country to encourage people to buy locally. It makes sense to encourage people to buy locally and to invest in your own economy, but it can really hurt other exports as well and trade relationships. So with too much product and not enough buyers, companies had to lay off employees. So when we don't have enough buyers who are going out shopping and buying clothing, who are buying cars, who are buying exports, different countries, if we have all this wheat and no one's buying it anymore, now we have a huge surplus and we have nowhere to put it, nothing to do with it. So people start losing their jobs. And many Canadians either faced a wage reduction or unemployment. So you can see here in this data file that we have, by 1930, Canada had a 13% unemployment rate. By 1933, this figure had climbed over to 26%. It fell back to 13% only when World War II broke out. So we essentially doubled our unemployment rate in just 3 years. That is a huge, huge jump, and 26% is definitely a big amount of our country being unemployed. So between 1929 and 1933, it is estimated that 1 in 5 Canadians became dependent upon the government relief for survival. So 1 in 5 Canadians did not have a sustainable income. In Saskatchewan during the 30s, the total provincial income plummeted by 90% in 2 years, forcing 66% of the rural population into welfare. So the provincial income in Saskatchewan dropped 90%. Now that is related to wheat and resources and exports, but 90%, that is massive. And if we look here in the chart, it says decline per capita income from 1928 to 1933. So as a whole, the income in Canada declined by 48% over those years. So almost 50%. Income almost dropped 50%. So if you are making, let's say, $20,000 as your income, which would have been a pretty decent income, in 1928 or 1933, really good income, you probably were now down to $10,000. In Ontario, it dropped about 44%, so very high compared to everyone else. We see 72% in Saskatchewan, which is the highest for sure, 61% in Alberta. Again, Prairie's hardest hit. We'll get into that a little more why in a minute. Manitoba, 49%. British Columbia, 47%, and then Quebec and the Maritimes, about 36 to 49. So big unemployment, huge issues with income, and it leads to just an extension of this Great Depression. So with the stock market crash and these years of people having to be laid off, and income dropping, we just extend this economic hardship longer and longer. Okay, so pause here again And I want you to go back to your questions on your first slide, and you can copy and paste them and put them in this slide. And then edit your questions, add to your questions, rethink your questions. I want you to essentially just rethink what you have. You can maybe add a couple sentences to a question, think of completely new ones, but just rethink what you have and see if you can develop more or better inquiry questions. So feel free, pause this video here, do that for a little bit, and then come back and we'll continue learning more about the 1930s and the Great Depression. Okay, so the consequences of the stock market crash. So we looked at really what caused the Great Depression. So we have the stock market crash, and then we have these pieces that have really led up to the crash and extended this economic hardship into the Great Depression. So what are the consequences? Well, millions of middle-class Canadians were unemployed. There was no unemployment insurance or severance pay and no universal health care at this time. So now if you get laid off, depends on your job, you can get severance pay, meaning your employer will give you X amount of money. Usually it relates to your current income to leave. So it kind of gives you a little cushion while you look for another job. You can also apply for unemployment insurance or employment insurance. You start paying into employment insurance today from your paycheck. So if that ever happens and you're unemployed or you find yourself out of work for a few months, the government will assist you as well. But in 1929 and through the 1930s, none of those supports existed. You were on your own. You had to have your own nest egg of savings to fall back on, and many people did not. Unskilled laborers, farmers, young people, and small businesses were the hardest hit. When we say unskilled laborers, those are people working in factory jobs that you train for a couple days and you learn that position on the assembly line. And it's something that doesn't necessarily need a lot of training or skills for. Like a skilled laborer would be something we think of in the trades today, like a machinist, a plumber, electrician, things like that. Many women were pushed out of jobs as it was unacceptable for a woman to take a man's job. So if you had a factory and half of your employees were women, more than likely you would fire either all or most of them and replace them with unemployed men because that was more socially acceptable at the time. So this forced women who had to find a way to earn money for their family to move back into domestic service roles. So that meant cleaning for a wealthy family's house or cooking for them, taking care of their kids, but usually working in a wealthy person's house for very little pay. And here we have some great images of workers essentially protesting, saying that they want to work, they want to make a wage. They aren't lazy, they are trying to find work, but it's just not available to them. In the 1920s, many had bought cars, furniture, and other goods on credit, so those loans. Now they could not pay off the debt, so items were repossessed. Repossession and eviction were constant looming threats. So say you bought a car on credit. So today, say you bought a car with your credit card and you can't pay off that credit card. Well, your credit card company or the bank or whoever can take your car back and say, well, we're going to take it. You technically can't pay for it. So it happened quite a bit. People lost their homes. They would lose their furnishings, or they would lose cars, anything that they had bought on credit, and even some things that they didn't, just to pay back their debts. And this is actually a pretty famous picture, and it's a pretty clear description of what's going on at the time. So you see this gentleman who had a very, very nice car. This would have been a pretty extravagant car at the time. And it says $100 will buy this car, must have cash, lost all on the stock market. So you have a gentleman who is probably pretty wealthy, looks like he has some driving gloves, pretty fancy outfit with his bowler hat. He was probably doing really well in the stock market, bought the car, and then it crashed. And now that's all he has, and he needs to get money, or maybe he owes money for it. So he's asking for $100 for it so he can pay it off. Okay, so let's talk about what happened in the prairies, so the Dust Bowl. So while the prairies were hard hit by exports, so no exports really happening at this time, no world trade or slow world trade, they were also hard hit by the climate. So we get what's called the Dust Bowl. Between 1929 and 1937, the prairies saw on and off droughts. 7.3 million hectares were affected by the drought. So very, very little rain, very dry conditions. Strong winds blew the loose, dry soil, creating dust storms. These storms in the prairies became known as the Dust Bowl. The dust blocked out the sun, covered houses, and was almost impossible to get rid of, and virtually no crops could grow. So they had such a bad drought, and the wind would start blowing and the heat would start going, and these big, huge dust storms and dust clouds, as you can see in this picture here, started forming. And essentially, it was just a wall of dust. When you were in a dust storm, you could not see the sun. There was no light. You couldn't see in front of you. It was actually a little dangerous to be outside, so you tried to hide inside. And when it finally passed over you, or the dust subsided, everything was coated in dust. So you can see here in this picture here and this picture that I'm covering, but you'll see better on your slideshow, everything was covered in dust. So this is a old buggy. We have a cart here. Just that's how deep the dust got. So with these really bad dry conditions and these dust storms, crops couldn't grow. So maybe it was actually a good thing that we couldn't really export crops because we didn't have crops to do that. However, that meant that farmers didn't necessarily have crops to sell within the Canadian market to make their own money or to even feed their families. And there wasn't just dust. There were also grasshoppers or locusts. So when it wasn't windy, grasshoppers swarmed looking for grass or wheat to eat, and they thrived on the warm weather. With no insect sprays or ways to get rid of the grasshoppers, the prairies were covered in clouds of grasshoppers. So imagine you've weathered through a dust storm, you're trying to sweep out all the dust from your house, which was nearly impossible. Everything was usually covered in dust in one way or another. And then all of a sudden you see the sky getting dark again, and it's not dust, but it is a cloud of grasshoppers coming your way. And now again, you are stuck inside your home trying to hide from this other weather condition or climate phenomenon with these grasshoppers coming in. And the grasshoppers are looking for anything to eat. So anything that you might have gotten growing at some point were potentially devastated by the grasshoppers on top of that. So the prairies, if we go back a few slides to the unemployment, it very much makes sense that their unemployment and their income had dropped so significantly because they were so poorly hit by both the stock market crash, the lack of exportation of resources, and now because of the climate and because of grasshoppers. Okay. So it wasn't necessarily all terrible during the 1930s. I know at this point it very much seems like doom and gloom. How did anyone smile at this point in time? But because there was the Great Depression, people also looked for the Great Escape. They looked for something to take their mind off of the limited income, the instability in work, or the lack of food that was in their home. And many people still, I would like to preface this and say, not everyone was extremely hard hit by the stock market crash. Some people got out in time, and some people were careful and didn't lose as much. So we do still have a middle class Canada. We do still have people that are living a sustainable life. But a vast majority of the population was hard hit. So we see Canadians try to escape the harsh reality of the 1930s, and they did so through entertainment. Radio boomed in the 1930s. This was the decade of radio. Everyone had a radio. Radio shows developed left, right, and center. Most homes had radios and listened to programs from the United States because they would reach up to Canada, and they were usually quite popular, but Canada tried to compete. And when we say radio programs, we don't mean what we think of today with Ryan Seacrest on the radio, playing music and doing a couple interviews with celebrities here and there. That happened. They did play music, but it was also usually live music that they would play at times. And they had shows, like full-on radio shows, like plays, radio plays that would happen. So they would have a cast of characters. Sometimes they would even dress up in the radio building where they were recording, and they would record a show. You would hear full-on shows. If anyone has seen the movie A Christmas Story, Ralphie is listening to a radio show. It's the Little Orphan Annie radio show that he's listening to. And that was a big thing for families and for children especially, is that you would gather around the radio and you would listen to these shows. And it was essentially the precursor to TV. So we also have in 1931 Maple Leaf Garden beginning to play in hockey games. So they started doing play-by-play versions of hockey games. So now you don't have to be in Maple Leaf Gardens to actually see the games. You can be at home. And then in 1936, we have the CBC. So the Canadian Broadcasting Company is formed, and they begin on radio. And now, of course, it's just boomed into what it is today. And we're seeing definitely, I think, a regeneration of the CBC, especially in television, with some excellent shows and excellent Canadian content. So then we also see movies and music start to develop and change as well. So we talked about in the 1920s how we saw silent movies, and then we saw the talkies come in, and we see Steamboat Willie being the first animated cartoon with synchronized sound, and movies and entertainment just keep progressing. So Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz are both released in 1939 in Technicolor. So now we get colored movies and colored film. That is just a big moment. I don't know the exact origins of the story, but it is said that at the premiere of Wizard of Oz, they didn't tell people that it was going to be Technicolor or when it was going to be. And if you haven't seen The Wizard of Oz, the original one, the beginning of the movie is in black and white. It's almost like a sepia tone. And then when Dorothy gets to Oz, everything is in Technicolor. And it's said that moviegoers, whenever they went to see The Wizard of Oz, there would just be audible gasps when it changed to color. And if you click the poster up here, you'll be able to watch that scene. It's a very iconic scene. We also see Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs by Walt Disney. This is the very first full-length animated movie released in 1938. So she is the very first Disney princess that comes to be, and the first full-length animated feature that we see, which leads to the development of the Disney company and really just shoots them to fame within full-length features and leads to the Disney movies that we know today. In music, popular music was still jazz. Jazz was still going very strong throughout the 20s, but we also get big band music and swing music. So American swing music swept through Canada and Europe. It was very, very popular. So this is when you picture people in the 30s and the 40s dancing together. They're jumping all around. People are getting thrown up in the air. It's very exciting. It's very lively music. In Europe, it was seen as being a very American thing. And swing music was very popular with teenagers throughout Europe, even within Germany and other fascist countries. And in Germany, swing music was actually banned, or they discouraged swing music because it was so American, and they didn't like that. And if you're interested, there's a great movie called Swing Kids that you can look into, and it talks about the rise of the Nazi Party within Germany, and it's all centered around teenagers and the idea of swing music. The Canadian market was flooded with American entertainment, from music to radio and movies. So we were still trying to find our own way to explore radio and to create movies, and really Hollywood and the American radio industry took off and became a big part of our Canadian entertainment here. And if you click the radio, you can actually go and listen to some swing music. Okay, so another positive thing that happened is a little more political, not as fun as swing music or Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but we do see the Statute of Westminster. So in 1926, the Imperial Conference came to a decision about the relationship between Great Britain and its dominions. So the Imperial Conference was essentially the representatives of the Great British Empire. So we have us here in Canada, Australia is there. I believe they might have had representatives from a few other smaller places as well. But as a whole, it was determined that these dominions needed some autonomy. So it recognized the autonomy of dominions and special ties within the British Commonwealth. So autonomy is essentially freedom or independence. So you have your own autonomy, your own freedom. So Canada could form its own foreign policy and legislation and no longer needed approval by the Crown. So this was a big move for Canada. We are still tied to Great Britain. We still have a special connection to them and the Commonwealth, so the other members of the empires, the other dominions, but we have a little more freedom. So we can now decide our foreign policy, which is going to come into play with World War II, so we can decide what we do with the rest of the world and how we interact with the rest of the world. And we can now pass our own laws, and we don't need to go to the Queen or the King for approval. So it started in 1926, and in 1931, it's officially passed by the British Parliament, and independence of the British dominions within the Commonwealth becomes a big moment. So throughout the statute, we see more independence. So slowly, Great Britain is loosening her grips on her empire, and these countries are becoming fully formed independent countries. And this is the signing of the Statute of Westminster and everything going on in the big meeting in 1931. Okay, so we have everything that's happened with the Great Depression. Now we have to look at what the government tried to do to relieve the Great Depression and the issues from the Great Depression. So we have R.B. Bennett, who was a conservative. He won the election in 1930. So he comes into power right after the stock market crashes, and he has to deal with the mess. So Bennett tried to fix the problem by increasing tariffs. So he thought that if he increased tariffs, so if he made it more expensive to buy goods from the United States and other countries, that would help the Canadian economy because people would buy Canadian and it would give it a boost. And it certainly helped some industries. However, it really hurt Canada's exports as countries like the United States responded by increasing tariffs on Canadian goods. So they retaliated. And remember, Canada's economy heavily relied on exports. So at this point, our exports dropped by 67%. That is a big, big drop. So essentially, it was just a retaliation. We told the United States we're putting more tariffs on your goods, and they said, fine, we're going to do the same thing, and really that just hurts everyone. We also see other attempts at relief. So the federal government reluctantly provided more financial assistance to provinces to help with unemployment. Before this, providing aid mainly fell on municipal and provincial governments. So R.B. Bennett and his conservatives really did not want to provide direct funds to the people to help with unemployment right away. They wanted to try some other things like other regulations, like through tariffs, but at a certain point they realized they had to provide more funding. So municipalities had been begging for more funding, the provinces did, so the government finally gave them some relief. However, Bennett was very much blamed for the hard times and was not popular because he did take a bit to actually provide any relief. So people start using his name as a way to make fun of their situation. So we have what's called a Bennett Barnyard, which was an abandoned farm, a Bennett Blanket, which was a newspaper because people were homeless and sleeping with newspapers to try to keep them warm. And then we have what's called a Bennett Buggy, which was a car pulled by a horse. So people couldn't afford gas anymore. So they had to figure out how to use the car in some way. So they hitched some horses to it or oxen to it, and that was a Bennett Buggy. They also tried something called relief camps. So in 1932, the federal government started relief camps or work camps. These were camps for single, homeless, and unemployed men. These were not home camps for children or for families, just for single, homeless, unemployed men. They would be working on projects like road building and receiving food and shelter for their manual labor. So essentially, these camps were seen to employ these men in return for their labor. They would get food, they would get shelter, and they'd get a little bit of money. Fort George in Niagara-on-the-Lake, if you've ever been there, it was actually reconstructed in the 1930s as a make-work project. So there were these relief camps, and then there were also separate projects that began cropping up throughout the country that were essentially projects just to employ people, usually some type of construction or manual labor project meant to employ as many people as they could. The camps were to stop the threat of homeless men roaming the streets and move the homeless and the unemployed problem out of sight and out of mind. So remember, they've done this in the past with the internment camps and with the Chinese Labor Corps and different groups throughout our history, is if we put them in camps or an area far away from the public eye, then it's not really a problem anymore. So if we put all the homeless, unemployed men in one area in the middle of the woods somewhere, all of a sudden our cities look nice and clean and we don't have that problem anymore. Even though the problem still exists, it's just in another part of the country. The men were paid very little, about 20 cents a day, and they were treated very poorly. They were usually verbally abused by the people who were running the camps. They were made to work day in and day out. Again, this was your choice to be there, though. You did not have to be there. It was not a mandatory thing, but a lot of people saw it as kind of their only option, their only place to have a shelter, or only place to get a meal. And at least with the 20 cents, you were making something, but hopefully you were healthy enough to do the work. Okay, so we do see a lot of unrest during this time. So we get what's called the On to Ottawa Trek. Frustrated with the conditions in the relief camps, poor work and little pay, men in relief camps in British Columbia began to voice their concerns. So they started to become very vocal, and they started to protest. So up here you can see actually a group of men marching kind of in protest with their signs, and they say, we want to be citizens, not transients. So transients are people who move from one place to another. They don't want to do that anymore. They want to be citizens. They want to have one place of work. So about 1,800 men started the On to Ottawa Trek, marching to Ottawa to present their grievances to Prime Minister Bennett. So this group of men were so frustrated and upset with the conditions and that things weren't really happening. There really was no relief in these relief camps. So they decided that they were going to walk from BC to Ottawa to present their grievances to the Prime Minister. They were going to come face to face with him and get him to understand their issues. They were led by a communist-sponsored union as well. And this leads into the fear of communism. We saw the Russian Revolution in the end of World War I, which was a communist revolution. So we see this idea of communism coming here into Canada through the workers' unions. Trekkers, as they were called, traveled on top of railway freight cars. So they didn't necessarily walk the entire time. They did travel on freight trains illegally. But you can see in this picture here, men climbing on top of trains, men getting into boxcars when they can. This was called riding the rails. And it was very dangerous for sure, but it was free transportation, but very, very illegal. So as they moved throughout the country, more men started to join who were in similar situations. And Bennett, the Prime Minister, wanted them stopped and supported an order to refuse them access to trains. So they could get on these trains. There really wasn't much stopping them anyway. Bennett wanted them stopped, and he tried to put forces at them to stop them. They ended up becoming stuck in Regina, so they really couldn't get access trains. They blocked them in, and they were stuck in the city of Regina. A small group were invited to Ottawa to talk to the Prime Minister. so only a few of them could actually go, and the talks broke down very, very quickly. The prime minister, it did not want to really listen to their cause and was not really empathetic to what they were going through, and there was no agreement that they could come to. So what ends up happening is the On to Ottawa trek becomes what's called the Regina Riot. So Bennett told the RCMP to clear the protesters who were in Regina on July 1st, and the leaders were arrested in Regina. So they had been staying, I believe they were actually at a fairgrounds area in Regina, and that's where they were staying while the talks were supposed to be going on in Ottawa. But the prime minister ordered the RCMP to clear everyone out and to arrest the leaders. This started a riot, so people were not happy. Marchers began fighting and throwing stones at the police, and the police came back swinging with their clubs. We have 1 dead and 130 are arrested. The Saskatchewan government assisted the marchers on their way back. So as they were leaving, they were very defeated by this riot. People started going back to other places within Canada. Most went back to BC, and the Saskatchewan government assisted them in whatever way they could. And this gets into how people were worried they would see a revolution like in Russia. So our workers were being treated very poorly. Our poor is being treated very poorly. They try to talk to the prime minister. They get nowhere. And what ends up happening is violence. And this very much mirrors what's happened in Russia with the poor and the workers are treated poorly. The monarchy and those in charge don't listen, and they just react with violence. So here is a great sign that we see because men were so mobile at this time, moving from one city to another on trains, moving from job to job wherever they can find it, relief camp to relief camp. Towns began putting up signs saying no transients, so no people moving wherever they wanted, no unemployed. This is one of the more famous ones. It says, "Jobless men, keep going. We can't take care of our own." So essentially this town is saying we can't take in anyone else. We can't help anyone else. We can only help our own, and we're already struggling with that. We do start to see a little more financial relief. So the municipal governments issued some relief payments, which became called the dole. So this was money that you would apply for and they would give you. It wasn't always money. Sometimes it was vouchers or food, or it came in another way. But between 1931 and 1937, about $813 million in municipal relief was given. And that is a ton of money. In Ontario, a family of 5 needed at least $6 a week for food. So that's how much it would cost a family of 5, about $6 a week. In Toronto, a family of about 7 people would get $6.93 a week. So we can estimate that a family of 5 would get less than that, and they needed at least $6 to eat. And $6.93 was a high rate for relief payments. So very often people would get these relief payments, but still not be able to eat or have shelter. And we see here a gentleman sleeping, and it says vacancy for roomers, relief vouchers accepted. So sometimes they would get vouchers for shelter for the night. Sleeping problems temporarily solved, government. And I think it's really making a comment on how apparently it's temporarily solved, but these issues aren't fully solved with these vouchers and with these rates. It was very tough to qualify for the dole or financial relief. In Ontario, these are the requirements you had to meet. So we have one, you have to prove you can't support your family, so prove that you're unemployed and you don't have enough money. You have to be a man, so women, we cannot necessarily apply for the dole. You have to have lived in your place of residence in the municipality for at least a year. This was very, very tough. Today, we tend to be pretty stationary when you buy a house and have a family. Some people move about, but back then it was a lot more common that people would move, especially for work. If your husband was unemployed, he was unemployed and he had to go somewhere else for work, you might be moving to a different municipality, finding a house there, then moving again once he tried to find another job. So people were very mobile at this time. So having a requirement being that you've lived in one place for a year is pretty tough. You had to turn in your driver's license and automobile plates. So essentially they saw car as a luxury. So if you had a car, that meant that you could clearly support your family. So you had to turn those in. You had to remove the telephone from your house. Again, another luxury that they wanted you to get rid of to prove that you didn't have money to support your family. You had to register at the unemployment office and show that you were willing to work and constantly looking for work. That is something we still have to do today, actually. You have to allow relief officers to inspect your home. So you have to let officials come into your home and, again, prove to them that you are destitute, prove to them that you don't have enough money. And the country was very, very divided between those on the relief and those not. Those not on relief funded the dole, so funded the relief through taxes, and many people resented that. So people didn't like that their money, their taxes were going through helping people who a lot of times they saw as lazy and not looking for work, even though that wasn't the case. They couldn't find jobs and they needed the help. And here we actually have a picture of the mission on Yonge Street. So missions were places where they would usually serve hot meals. They would have clothing for people, and you can see just how busy it is outside. Okay, so again, you're going to pause the video here. You are going to copy your questions, bring them into this slide, and you can add to them, you can rethink them, you can edit them, change them up if you like, but once you have a few questions you like, continue on. So we've dabbled in some things of relief, but really we need more. The country of Canada needs more help. So by 1935, it was clear to Bennett that his initial reforms with high tariffs and relief camps weren't working. He found ideas and inspiration from the American president Franklin D. Roosevelt and his New Deal. Bennett took Roosevelt's New Deal and applied it to Canada with a few changes. So Franklin D. Roosevelt is one of the well-known presidents of the United States. So he came in and took over the United States during the Great Depression and brought in these economic reforms, brought in social assistance programs, and really led the United States out of the Great Depression. He was known for doing what were called fireside talks. So he would get on the radio and have these personal conversations with people through the radio. It was like, people said that it was like him talking to you. So sitting right beside him at the fire as he discussed what was going on. And he was trying to be in touch with the United States and what was going on for people. So R.B. Bennett, the Canadian Prime Minister, tried to essentially imitate what Franklin D. Roosevelt was doing. So here we have a look at Roosevelt versus Bennett's New Deal. So in the United States, we have this federal workers projects, so kind of like relief camps. Government controls on farms, so less surplus, government loans available to farmers. Banks have to guarantee their customers the availability of bank deposits up to $5,000. So remember how in the United States, banks had invested customers' money and lost some customers' money. They had to guarantee that within the bank, they would have at least $5,000 per person that they had as an account. Unemployment insurance was a part of his deal, old age pension, maximum work hours, minimum wage, and reduced tariffs on goods from other countries. So Bennett took it and kind of reformed it a little bit to fit Canada. So he did progressive taxation, a maximum work week, so having a solid weekend with a maximum hours per week, minimum wage. So we do see a lot of crossover here. Stronger regulations of a work environment, so making sure that they're safe and you aren't being taken advantage of. Unemployment insurance, so you pay into unemployment insurance, so if you are unemployed, you have something to fall back on. Health and accident insurance, revised old age pension, agriculture support programs, and the grain board to regulate wheat prices. So how did Canada react to Bennett's New Deal? Well, it was the opposite to Bennett and his conservative views. So it was really going against everything Bennett had kind of built his platform on. And many saw his social and economic promises and policies with the New Deal as very communistic. So again, we hear this threat of communism coming in. The House of Commons members agreed with his policy. They really just needed the support and knew people needed relief. So it was pretty unanimous that, yep, these would pass. However, voters saw it very differently. So this was also an election year. So Bennett brought in this relief or proposed the relief right as the election was starting to get underway. The voters, they didn't trust Bennett. After 5 years without proper relief, they did not think that this would actually go through. And even though he had proposed all these things to them, it was just promises that he probably wouldn't keep. So people said King or chaos. So King was his opponent, and they believed Bennett was chaos. And in October 1935, he was defeated in the election, and Prime Minister Mackenzie King took over office, and he was a Liberal Prime Minister. He had actually been prime minister before. He had been prime minister in the 1920s, and Bennett had defeated him, and now he was coming back, and he defeated Bennett at this time around. Almost all of Bennett's proposals were thrown out by the courts as they were beyond the government's powers. So the New Deal, Bennett's New Deal, really didn't actually come to be. And here we see the idea of king or chaos. So we have our figure here, who's supposed to represent Mackenzie King, is asking, may I cut in, to this lady here, the Canadian citizen. Again, remember, Miss Canada. Canada is usually portrayed by a woman. We see her dancing, but we see her feet are getting stepped on. Broken promises and unemployment. Her foot's iron, so iron's being stepped on. And then we have this gentleman here who's the one dancing with her, stepping on her feet, and it's R.B. Bennett. And then when she gets asked if he can cut in, my savior. So she's representing the Canadian citizens, and they're calling King the savior. So new prime minister, new relief. Well, Prime Minister Mackenzie King had been prime minister from 1921 to 1930. In 1930, he lost to R.B. Bennett, but by 1935, he had gained power again. Like I said, he was a Liberal prime minister, so pretty different views. What he ended up doing was he negotiated trade agreements with the US and Great Britain. And this reduced tariffs on Canadian goods in the US and made the US Canada's preferred trading partner. So we became in the good books with the United States again, and we got rid of the tariffs, and he got rid of the tariffs that Bennett had worked to build up. So before we move on to look at the rest of the world, within Canada, we really don't see much more relief efforts coming to pass in a big way. Really, what gets us out of the Great Depression is going to be the economic revival with the war that we will get into eventually. So let's look at what the rest of the world was doing during the Great Depression. So you have the United States. They were very hard hit by the Great Depression, extremely hard hit. Throughout the 1930s, they passed neutrality laws to try to stay out of conflict. So again, they really didn't want to get too involved in World War I. Then they came in at the last minute and then decided, as other conflicts were erupting throughout Asia and throughout Europe once more, that they were going to try to remain neutral. So they tried to isolate themselves from the budding world conflict. So they really just kind of wanted to be their own thing. Then we have Russia on the other side of things. So in 1921, they saw a civil war between, again, we've talked about the Russian Revolution. It was between peoples, between communists and anti-communists. The communists won out. The Soviet Union was behind other industrial nations. So it's at this point that we see the name moving from Russia to the Soviet Union. And their industry was very slow to develop. So they didn't have the same industrialization and mechanization as we did in North America. So they were pretty far behind. Joseph Stalin took power. So you might not remember this, but Lenin was the leader of the Bolsheviks and the one who took over in 1918 and 1919 with the revolution. He passed away And in the 20s through the 30s, Joseph Stalin takes power. And he is a pretty terrible guy. He leads to, well, we'll talk about what he leads to in a second. So what he does is he introduces mass industrialization and collective farming. So he really tries to push for an industrialization in Russia, which means that really he tried to push people into this idea of industrialization. They moved very quickly. It was pretty dangerous. But more importantly, this idea of collective farming was that you didn't necessarily own your crops. So you would farm your area, but your crops were owned by the Soviet Union. Everyone would essentially own part of the grains. So you would farm, you would give it to the collectivization. So they would take your wheat or whatever you had, and then they'd bring it into the cities. And it was supposed to, in theory, it would be distributed evenly amongst all of the citizens. So even if you weren't a farmer, you could still have produce from farms. But this wasn't always the case. Usually what happened was big cities or the rich and the elites still got more food, and it took those resources and food away from the farmers. So agriculture of the USSR collapsed and millions starved. So this was through many different points that we won't really get into today. But with this collectivization of farming and with other rules and regulations and whether that comes into place, Stalin essentially ends up starving his farmers. They don't have enough food to feed themselves, let alone send out to others. Anything that they do is taken and sent. So we get extreme poverty and extreme starvation throughout what is now Ukraine and other agricultural areas within Russia. Stalin himself was very paranoid of being overthrown, so he used what were called show trials to get rid of his enemies. So essentially, he would not like person X, so he would say, I'm going to charge person X with this, put them in front of a trial, so it kind of looked like the person was being put through a court system, but really, this person was guilty automatically. If Stalin didn't like them, they would end up in jail. So we end up with a big dictatorship within communist Russia. And then in Italy, so the Great Depression and what's going on with the economy, everyone is very downtrodden. Everyone is looking for relief. And if someone tells you, I have a new idea for collectivization of farming so we can get everyone food, you're going to listen and be like, okay, that might be good. If someone else says, you know what, you've been too hard hit by the Great Depression and other things, I can get us out of this. I am going to give you money. I am going to make us great again. I am going to give us power again. A lot of people start to listen. And you're in a position where sometimes you feel like that person is the only way out, that extremist is the only way out. And we see this in Russia, but we also see this in other places in the world. So Italy did not get the land that they wanted after World War I. They felt very betrayed because they did not get the land that they were promised for switching sides, and they had lost many people in the war as well. Benito Mussolini was the leader of what became the Fascist Party, and he rose to power. So he formed his own fascist party, which we'll talk about the idea of fascism and communism a little later as we move into World War II. I will define these types of governments a little more for you. But just in general, he essentially was a dictator who believed that he would rule and that Italy was going to be strong. He was going to make them a strong nation again. But he did that through banning unions and strikes. So public couldn't really voice their opinion. There was very heavy censorship throughout Italy. So we see Mussolini rising to power in Italy. Then in Germany, we see Germany, who was greatly devastated by the Great Depression and the Treaty of Versailles. So remember, Treaty of Versailles, they had to pay the other countries money, while at the same time, everyone's in a Great Depression. So not only do they have to pay billions of dollars, they are hit even harder by this economic time. So Hitler and his Nazi party are able to rise to power. They are able to create a rhetoric in Germany that they are the answer to the problem. They are going to solve the problem. They are going to make Germany strong and feared again. So he comes to power in 1933. And we are going to talk a lot more about Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin as we move throughout World War II. So you can kind of see how this economic hardship really allows these dictators and these strong people to rise up. Okay, so this is going to be your final list of inquiry questions. So do any last minute editing, last minute additions, and have a few solid questions that you like. And you're going to take those questions and post them in the discussion area on D2L, and then continue on. Okay, so now that you have your final inquiry question, you're going to pick one. So you might have 2 or 3, you might have more than that, you might even just have one that you're really working with. You are going to have one to focus on, and you are going to attempt to answer that question using the topics and evidence that we went over today or your own research. So like in the 1920s, I gave you an inquiry question and you answered it. Now you've created your own inquiry question, and we're going to kind of attempt to answer it in a little different way. So your answer to this inquiry question is going to become a thesis statement. So continue on to the next slide for more information about a thesis statement. So what is a thesis statement? Well, if you've written an essay before, you've probably come across a thesis statement. But just as a good review, a thesis statement is a compass for an essay. So it is the direction for our essay. It is where we are going to go. It is 1 to 2 sentence statement that tells the reader the writer's point of view of a topic, so their opinion or argument, and the reasons and evidence they will use to support their point of view. So a thesis statement is just 1 or 2 sentences, and it's a statement telling you what your point of view is and essentially why and how you're going to prove it. So how do you write a thesis statement? Follow these steps to help you write your thesis statement. As you move through the rest of the slideshow, fill out this worksheet. So if you click this worksheet, it will be linked to a worksheet for you to complete with the steps and examples within it. So this is going to direct you on how to build a thesis statement. And that's all you have to do for this. You're not going to write a full written response to your inquiry question. I just want you to practice writing a thesis statement that if you were going to answer your inquiry question, that is what would be your thesis statement. So step 1, ask a question. You already have your inquiry question. This will be the starting point of your thesis. So we've already done step 1 together. Step 2, you're going to answer your question. Your answer is your opinion, not a fact. So it has to, again, falls into the idea of being arguable. It's an opinion. It should be your point of view that can be argued and debated. When you write and research an essay, your answer to the question may change as you go. For now, start with the initial thoughts based on what you learned today to answer your question. Step 3, provide reasons for your answer. So back up your point of view. Your reasons or evidence will support your opinion. They will be the bulk of your essay. So essentially, they would be the points, the main paragraphs of your essay. Try to provide a few strong pieces of evidence or reasons to support your point of view. And then step 4, put your argument together in 1 to 2 sentences, so your actual thesis statement. So start with your opinion or your answer to your question, then state your evidence that backs it up. So you can see here in your example, I've highlighted the argument, the 1920s did not roar, and then the pieces of evidence, the reasons behind it. And then finally, you're going to refine your thesis, okay? So you're going to make sure it's a strong thesis, so it's a specific, it's disputable, and it's coherent. So go through these steps. Like I said, everything is on that worksheet for you. It's detailed there. If you need help, please contact me. But there's also this is a great video going over what is a strong thesis. And once you have that worksheet done with your thesis statement at the bottom, your refined thesis statement for step 5, we're going to submit that to D2L. And that is the assignment that you're doing today. So I know this is definitely a longer video and this is a longer note. There was a lot to cover for the 1930s, but this is going to build us up into World War II, which we will start in next block. So if you have any questions, please reach out to me. Other than that, guys, have a great day.